Okay, so we'll quickly begin with Things Fall Apart. People who had not read Things Fall Apart, I hope you have read it now. If you haven't, I hope you're in the process to read it now. That's number one. Number two is we will briefly comment upon the title because the title is important for us to go into the body of the text. The title, as you know, is Things Fall Apart. It is a direct reference to William Butler Yeats's poem, The Second Coming. The lines in The Second Coming are things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosened upon the world, something like that, right? So, things fall apart then is su succeeded by the phrase, the center cannot hold. So it's not merely that it is the image of destruction, but it is also image of destruction due to something where the, due to a sort of implosion, that things that are supposed to cohere together are not cohering any longer. The center cannot hold. Remember in the previous class, we talked about how in Things Fall Apart, we see both the outside influences that are at work to bring the Igbo culture as is presented in the novel down, but also the forces internal to Igbo culture that were detrimental to its long continuation anyway. For example, and we mentioned this several times, and many of you contributed to the discussion, how the twins were always abandoned in the evil forest because they were thought of as reincarnations of certain evil spirits, about how women, although some women had somewhat higher position in society, for example, the priestess who takes Ezinma on her back and takes her to get her cured, women in general had a subservient position in life. So while men could have many wives, the wives were necessarily dependent upon the men for their subsistence and also for their existence. And then there were people who were marginal and outcast people. There were certain character traits that were appreciated. So in men, strength, brutality, violence was largely appreciated. If women had the traditionally considered effeminate traits, for example, Okonko's father and Okonko's son, they were looked down upon, etc. But even so, there are certain pressures in Igbo society that were not good for the long continuation of the society that it was, but also that the forces that come into this society from outside, they are much more violent, they are much more brutal, and they probably hasten the downfall of the society that it was till then. So the title itself suggests that this is a story of disintegration. Things fall apart, things disintegrate. What is interesting, what Achibe is doing is he is presenting to us the pre-colonial Igbo society. So towards the end of the 19th century, the pre-colonial Igbo society as a logical whole, which had its own interior laws. So although women were not highly regarded, but men were supposed to look after these women. So it had a logic, which may not always be a logic of equals, but it had a logic and things were going ahead in certain ways. In the first half of the novel, we look at Umuofia as a whole before the chaos of colonization comes in. The chaos of colonization comes into the second half of the novel. What we see is the going together of the psycho-spiritual downfall of the community. So the spirituality upon which the community was cohering was based. So the revering of the ancestral spirits, the revering of the reincarnations of the spirits, so those masked elders, that is decimated, that is, so unmasking the spirit is murdering the spirit. So that comes down, but this also happens simultaneously with an economic interest. So there's a trading store that is built, a trading store with which the Umuofians trade. So although they don't believe in the religion of these white people, but they do not have great problems trading with the white people. And this is the story of colonialism everywhere. We know that like Tagore says, the বণিকের মানদণ্ড পোহালে সর্বরই দেখা দিল রাজদণ্ড হয়ে. So trade interests come hand in hand with missionary interests, come hand in hand with colonial government and military force. The desecration of existing Igbo practices, of Umofian practices, they happen slowly. They don't happen immediately from the very beginning. And we also see how Mr. Smith was a more tolerant sort of a reverend than Reverend Brown, who was willing to go all out in picking up fights with the Umofians. There are, it's possible to look at, divide these chapters up in certain groups. So in chapter 16, and which also shows us the gradual the gradual effect that the missionary power and the inroads that the missionary power makes into the Umuofian society. In chapter 16, we hear about the missionaries proselytizing, but we only hear about them. We don't, they are not considered to be menaces. In chapter 17, the missionary builds the church in the taboo forest, in the evil forest. And what was the faith among the Umuofians? Their faith was that gods can take care of themselves, and therefore, if anybody builds a church in the taboo forest, they are bound to fall down. But that does not happen. In chapter 18, outcasts and are co-opted. And remember, the outcasts in this society were expected to keep long hair so that they could easily be marked as outcasts. Their long hair is cut off, so now they can pass as anybody else. In chapter 20, worthy men of the society join. And in chapter 22, the ancestral spirit is unmasked and thereby killed. So we see from the beginning, where people are laughing at two white missionaries proselytizing, to the time in which the ancestral spirit is metaphorically, figuratively murdered, is a long process, but it's also a gradual process, a process that becomes more and more violent. But it cannot become violent simply by its on its own. It becomes violent by incorporating people who had already been pushed outside of the margins, outside to the margins of the Umofian society. At the end, we see that Okonkwo wanted Umofia to fight because that was the noble thing to do. And he kills himself because he cannot live with the ignominy of what he knew was going to befall him. But the rest of the people in the Umuofian society do not kill themselves. They try to find out a way of cohabiting with these alien powers. So we also see that just like in Umuofian society, in Igbo society, there were people in the margins. Even somebody like Okonkwo, whose fame was revered around nine villages, who was known as the greatest warrior because he had overthrown the warrior called the cat, because he looked as if he was walking on springs and he was ready to jump upon anybody and beat them up. He who had risen from nothing, his father had nothing, but he has three wives, he had many yams, and he had a lot of land to cultivate. So all of this, so this is a man in the center, this is a man who is considered one of the revered elders of Umofia. Even he has to fall down. So uh, why is it that Okonkwo falls down and other revered elders such as Obi Reika do not? Because they also try to maintain some sort of balance. They try to realize that Igbo culture and society is not something that is static, that has to be taken forward and modified for things to for it to continue, which Okonkwo refuses to acknowledge. Now, what is so with colonialism? Again, in all sorts of colonial places, we understand colonialism as also being the harbinger of modernity. Why do we call it the harbinger of modernity? Because in colonialism, one form of knowledge takes precedence over another form of knowledge. So the Western, think about India, think about 19th century. So let's say there were traditional medical practices. Now, remember, I am not talking about whether or not they were good or bad. I am not saying that. I'm trying to say how traditional medical practices are superseded by Western medical practices and Western systems of medicine. how traditional attire is taken over by Western attire, how indigenous modes of learning, and you all study in Sanskrit college, which is a college which is supposed to which is supposed to impart indigenous knowledge in the Western mode. So they are not establishing a toll to impart indigenous knowledge. They are establishing a college to impart indigenous knowledge. So what in different spheres of life, every again also remember, if you when you read fairy tales or you read about the fiction about the 19th century, you hear things like Ratri Deep Prohore. Now Ratri Deep Prohor is not necessarily 2 a.m. The clock time, which is a Western mode of dividing the day, also takes precedence. So the knowledge of time is also brought in from elsewhere, and that takes precedence over the knowledge of time that we had till then. As a result, what happens in the novel is that it's impossible for us to, although Achibe tries to present a coherent version of the society itself was no longer coherent at the time of the colonial encounter. The society was fragmented, and often the way in which the narration goes round in circles. The narration does not follow the linear progression of time and action that we are used to in Western modes of storytelling. Now, before we look into how colonialism erodes Western Igbo society as we know it, we first have to look into what were the contradictions and distinctions within Igbo society already. So we had the disagreement between Okonko and Obereka about tapping palm trees, and Okonko thought that people who are titled, remember, people, every time you want to take a new title, you have to feed these many people and you have to achieve these many things. So Okonko thought that titled men should not be tapping palm trees. But Obereka thought that titled men could tap palm trees. And also remember, they look down upon certain villages, because in those villages, getting a title is so easy that even titled men, people with 9 titles or 8 titles or 3 titles, they can be seen as tapping palm trees. So even between villages or in the same village, there are different assumptions of what the correct way of being should be. Okonko scorns his mother's people. He does not take kindly to the people who are his mother's side of the family. He thinks of them as a womanly clan. He does not think of them as a clan which is a... Okay, sorry, I had not seen the questions. Can we justify a process which is selfish even though it took time? Okay, I don't know which process you're talking about. We'll come back to that. Even Okonko's son also converted to Christianity, which shattered him from inside. Fine. But also remember, Okonko's son in Okonko's household is a marginalized figure. Okonko's son, Noe, I think his name is Nwoye, sorry, reminds Okonko of his father, who was both a dreamer and one who did not have a lot of physical, or did not want to get into fights and thereby get new land. So these are characters who are unlike Okonko, and by being unlike Okonko, they are different. They are in the margins of society. Selfish and violent when the ancestral spirit is unmasked. Who is selfish and violent when the ancestral spirit is unmasked? Can we consider Okonko's suicide as his own brand of rebellion against colonial powers? Of course, we have to consider it as also a rebellion against colonial powers, but at the same time, it's not merely a rebellion. He is not, it does not, from the text, does not seem like Okonko is doing this because this is the only way in which he can protest against colonial power. It is for us to read it in that manner. But Okonko is probably doing it because he cannot live with the ignominy that he knows will befall him when he is no longer allowed to, or is incapable of being the sort of important man that he was in his village. So he is probably doing it for one cause, but when we see him doing it, we read it as also symbolic of other forces. Okay, we'll go back to what we were doing. We were talking about the distinctions in Umofia society. There are some clans who plays the dead during the sacred week in the evil forest. Some clans do it, some other clans do not do it. So there is some confusion over that. But despite these differences, there are certain essential elements that most people in all of the 9 villages that we are talking about follow. There might be certain local variations, but the revering of the ancestral spirits, to constantly live your life in a way in which the ancestral spirits are equal participants of your life, to observe certain rituals of farming, to observe certain rituals of fertility, to observe certain rituals of peace, and to have counterbalances towards whatever breaks these weeks rituals of peace and farming and fertility. More or less, there was a sort of agreement over these. Now remember, Noe, Okonko's son, is distressed by the voice of the crying twins in the evil forest, as well as the death of Ikemefuna. But when Noe has experiences that distress, and when he is unhappy at Ikemefuna's death, Okonko does not speak kindly to him. So in the same household, Okonko and his son are probably representing two entirely different sides of the same culture. Okonko obeys the rules of the clan even when they goes against him. For example, when he is fined. So Okonko has 3 indiscretions. Remember, first he had what was the first indiscretion? Right, he had killed Ikemefuna. Second, he had beat his wife during the week of peace. And third, he had accidentally let loose his gun and killed a young man. For the final one, he sent for 7 years of exile to his mother's village. So Okonko might not agree with whatever the clan says, but he follows and he obeys the punishments that are meted out to him by the clan. But unlike him, Noe does not do that. Noe goes outside of the clan in order to find solace. So there are some people who are traditionally by birth designated as outcasts, they find solace. But somebody like Noe, who is not traditionally by birth designated as outcast, he also finds solace in Christianity. And it is the strength of Christianity, the way Christianity is being preached here, that while people had been turned out of the established society, they are embraced by this Christianity. And when more and more Umuofians find that their own people are embracing Christianity, Obereka tells Okonko that how can you hold a knife against your own brother? So it is possible to get into a fight, it is possible to beat up or murder people when they are white people. But when people from our own families, people who are from our own clan, have joined this foreign religion, how do we get into a fight with them? There is also a rupture between the past and the present. The past, the time form of the past that we see is the messianic time. What is messianic time? Messianic time is cyclical in nature. It is constantly renewed. How is this constant renewal marked in the novel? It is marked by market days and agricultural rhythm. Again, remember we talked about how colonial time is something that is about progression, but messianic time, cyclical time, is about crop cycles, about agricultural cycles, about fertility festivals, etc. So they are not marked by weeks or necessarily or by months, but more in terms of between market day to market day, from one crop's planting to another crop's harvesting, etc. People are also marked by this messianic time. Remember Enzima. Who's Enzima? Enzima's Okonko's daughter, who's born to his second wife. She is believed to have died as a child and was reborn several times. She's called an Ogbanje, Ogbanje, who while dying gets reborn and dies again. So every new child that is born is not considered to be a new child. A new child is considered to be a reincarnation of children who have been there before, who have died, gone away, and come back. people who prophesize and people who are soothsayers, they do not experience time as homogeneous or empty time, which is our time, but what they do experience it as laws that have to be obeyed. If laws are not obeyed, what will befall the time is already well known. So look at this. For our homogeneous empty time, which is the time of modernity, we know what we should do, but we don't always know if we don't do this, what is going to happen. But in messianic cyclical time, you already know why you should follow certain laws. So if you do not do this and this ritual, then such and such a thing will happen to you. I know this because this has already happened before. Okay, so laws are the soothsayers and the people who make prophecies and the spirits who confer and consult and who know what has to be done. They do so because they have already lived through, or at least in imagination and in oral narrative, they have lived through the same things over and over again. They also believe that, and I already mentioned this, that the gods will carry out their own revenge, but this prophecy does not unfortunately materialize. Now, what happens if everybody becomes a Christian? Cyclical time can work because our descendants remember our ancestors. Our ancestors and their spirits are part of our everyday life because we remember them. But in Christianity, I don't have that option. If everybody becomes a part of a different religion, who will then care for me when I die? And that is one of the things that haunts Okonkwo. Who will pay obeisance to him when he dies, when he becomes a spirit? Because his son has already become a Christian. So what is to happen to our ancestors who have been living with us as spirits? Where will they go? Something interesting we should remember here is that the book, remember at the end of the novel, the commissioner plans to tells us that he will write a book. I'll read this out. The commissioner went away, taking 3 or 4 of the soldiers with him. In the many years in which he had toiled to bring civilization to different parts of Africa, so already look at what the commissioner thinks of himself. He thinks that he has brought civilization to Africa. He had learned a number of things. One of them was that a district commissioner must never attend to such undignified details as cutting down a dead man from a tree. Such attention would give the natives a poor opinion of him. In the book which he planned to write, he would stress that point. As he walked back to the court, he thought about that book. Every day brought him some new material. The story of this man who had killed a messenger and hanged himself would make interesting reading. One could almost write a whole chapter on him. Perhaps not a whole chapter, but a reasonable paragraph at any rate. There was so much else to include, and one must be firm in cutting out details. He had already chosen the title of the book after much thought: The Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of the Lower Niger. But what we have seen so far is that these tribal people, they have not appeared to be primitive in any way. In fact, although they are imagined as primitive, they have a highly evolved and complex sense of the world, which is repeatedly destroyed by not Okonkwo, by the colonial powers. So, but for the colonial master, these are primitive tribes that he is pacifying. And for somebody like Okonkwo, who is the central character in 9 villages whose fame is spread all across and who has lived such an epic life, he is going to be relegated to merely 1 paragraph in the novel in the book by this man. Now, the book that we are reading, Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart, also is is talking back to the book which is going to be written by the commissioner. But the book that Chinua Achebe has written in English, remember the commissioner's book is also going to be in English. These are 2 very, very different books. The commissioner is looking down upon the tribes, looking down upon them as primitives, looking at himself as bringing them peace and civilization. Achebe, although writing in English, is writing as somebody who holds in respect the rituals and the culture that the other man is constantly denigrating. Achebe has something specific to say about the use of the English language. Achebe considers it as something that has been pushed down their throats, like us. We did not have to learn English if India had not been colonized by the British. But once it has been pushed down our throats, can we ignore it? Can we say that no, we will not read English anymore when so much of our lives are now ordained by English? And that is what Achebe also says, that that this can be used, the English language can be used as a tool in order to reach a greater audience, which local languages will not give us. Also remember that Okonkwo's death does not signify the death of the entire society, but it is a specific version of the society that dies. He was great, but he also bullied people. He bullied his son. He broke many laws. He beat up himself, his wife. That version of himself, he killed Ikemefuna. He did not have to do it, but he did that. So that version of the society dies. What does not die, nevertheless, are people like Obireka who try to adopt and take only those sections of their life that can match to a new world. Okonkwo was the greatest hero of the Umuofian people, but he was also a private and alienated man. He was not somebody who could match with everything. He was always, remember, he's somebody who is forever trying to prove a point. His greatest fear was that he would be considered as somebody who is afraid. In short, he would be considered as somebody who is like his father. He did not want to do that. So things that he's doing, he's not merely doing that because he wants to show that he respects the tribe, but also because he's forever challenging himself to prove himself to be more and more brave, to be accepted as the bravest person by everybody else. I'll make one final comment and then I will look at the questions. The final comment is about the narrator. Who is the narrator? We don't know. It's an omniscient narrator, but also a nameless narrator. But the narrator makes use of certain phrases. He says, or they say, the Igbo people, says among the Igbo, says they, these people, etc. So the narrator is not somebody who is exactly identifying as the Igbo, as an Igbo person, but the narrator is also not outside of the Igbo world because of the immense knowledge and tenderness with which the narrator presents the Igbo world. So the role of the narrator, we'll come to it in a subsequent class. The narrator seems to me to be like one of the elders in this village. The elders who tell stories, who take stories to next generations, because stories are all that they could learn from. This narrator in English, in this novel, in this printed novel, seems to be doing the same thing. Okay, this is what I shall stop here and we shall look at the questions that are there. If you have further questions, please write them down. The author also fails to grant Okonkwo's mother a name. This is, I think Srija has said this. Okay. According to Freud, the rejection of one's father preceded the sexual impulses for one's mother. Is this apt in the context of Things Fall Apart? Srija, I don't think Freud is necessarily saying that the father is rejected. Father is rejected as an object of desire, but father is also envied and aspire, and one aspires to be like the father because it is the father who has the mother, right? So it's not an absolute rejection because then we would not have castration complex and things like that, but because the penis is what the father signifies and symbolizes, that not the actual physical penis necessarily, but also the power and the authority that comes with it. So but I agree that it is possible to have a Freudian reading of this novel because we do see that Okonkwo rejects his father because Okay, number one, I don't know why Okonko's mother is not named, but most women in the novel are not named, apart from the priestess, the second wife, or the three wives, and one daughter, right? No one else is named. So it is probably also a reflection of the society in which women matter much less than men do. That's one. And second is, I don't know whether he rejects the father because the father is. In a Freudian sense, the father, but in the novel, it seems he rejects the father because the father does not fulfill the masculinity that he expects from the father and the masculinity that he expects to see in his son, which is why he rejects both the father and his son. Aditi's question isn't Okonko's mask of being superior physically somewhat proved hypothetically, uh, some, proves hypothetical similarities between Unoka and Okonko? It does, and it does not, because he he because he's so afraid that he will be equated with Unoka that he has to repeatedly prove himself to be superior to everybody else. So he's not, for him it's not a mask. He believes that he's superior, but it is also something that he has to be proving repeatedly to himself and to others. Yeah, there is also the unnamed first wife. Yeah, women are in general not named. Can we consider Okonko as a tragic hero with hamartia, excessive pride, and ego? Yes, of course, Okonko is a tragic hero, but his tragedy is twofold. It's he is actually the hero of classical tragedy because it is through his downfall that we also read the downfall of the society. He does not only fall because of excessive pride and ego. He That is probably a simplification, but he falls because the times in which he could have been an hero, the Umofian society in which somebody like Okonko would have been a hero, that Umofian society does not exist any longer. So it is also a tragedy of the time. The ways of life that we were so used to, the readers should have, the people should have been used to, it does not exist anymore. Okay. Shuman saying, can we have Foucault for the father's power dynamics? Wouldn't unnamed women raise feminist questions? Okay, there's a problem with the way in which most of your questions are being articulated. We should not, let's not take Foucault or take Freud and add them on the text like, toppings or garnish. No, what are the critical tools that Foucault and Freud give us? And using those critical tools, what questions can we ask? So how do the unnamed women raise feminist questions? Of course, they raise feminist questions. They raise questions. Why is it? And that is precisely what Srija was asking. Why is it that women are not named in the novel? But the answer probably lies in the fact that it shows the women's subservient position in the novel, right? That's number one. So if you want to call it a feminist question, yes, it is a feminist question, but it is also a question about the plot, the structure, and the style and the content. uh, can we I
Ma'am,
don't Yeah, okay, quickly, we have only 2 minutes.
ma'am, don't you think that Okonko somewhat is representing the traditional egoism of his times, and at the same time there is a struggle between subservient survival, the very fact of survival, and the clash between traditional egoism and survival,
Okay,
because he is not
okay,
able
got
to
it,
live.
got it, got it, got it. You did ask the question. Sorry, I did not see it. I think it went up faster than I could see it. Yes, that is what I was saying, that he has a certain way of being a hero. Of course, to be a hero, your ego has to be like a balloon. So in his way of, but the way of being a hero is no longer valid. The world in which that heroism, that ego, that propels him to be a hero, that propels him to be the greatest warrior, that world does not exist anymore. Yes, you are right. In this world, the world that we have of colonial encounter, it is, you have to manage negotiation becomes more important than beating people up or outright violence. So yes, he cannot survive in this world because he does not have the skills necessary to survive in this world. But the same skills were good when the world was different. Final question from Lucy. Okonko throughout the text underestimates his father, but at the end of the text they were in the same position. Well, for that matter, we will all die. So yes, but yeah, so Okonko is not an admirable character. Okonko is a tragic character who suffers a great fall, but can we admire him? Sometimes we admire him because of his bravery, but beyond that, he has been brutal, he has been violent, he has really bullied a lot of people. So no, yeah, he does meet the same fate that his father does. Okay, our time is over. I have been lax in setting up the Google Classroom. I will do it immediately, but I have a series of tasks that I've given you. Please join the classroom. I'll send it out today itself and do the tasks that I've given you. And I know that you've been worrying about your exams. Please don't worry about them. Goodbye. All right, welcome back. This, I think, is our third Things Fall Apart lecture. So, before we begin discussing the text, I thought we could possibly look at some of the questions from the last two classes. So, if you've accessed the Google Classroom, then you would know what are the questions that were asked in the chat box during the last two classes. I think we managed to address most of them in the duration of the class itself, but a few of them I thought was inadequately addressed or I missed altogether. And we shall begin today's class by looking at those questions. It is imperative that you join the Google Classroom, because if you do not, I have no records to show. So eventually, if the university says no classes, like I have this recording, but that you interacted, the only proof that I have is your presence in the classroom. So it is imperative that you do that. Failing which, we are not going to continue with synchronous classes. If you do not join the Google Classroom, we will go completely asynchronous. So if that is what you want, you're welcome. But if you do not want that, then please join the Google Classroom. Right. So we begin by looking at, I think there are 3 or 4 questions that we did not adequately address in the previous two classes. So we'll look at them. Okay, in the first class, there was someone who has a Realme phone. They said that the thing that the Western world has always thought, that the eastern part of the world is illogical, is very much evident here. I don't know who this was. This was a Realme phone. So I agree. The answer to that would be yes, I agree. And the reason behind that is, to understand the reason behind that, we have to go to one of the founding texts of post-colonialism, that is Edward Said's book, Orientalism. I don't remember whether we have discussed Orientalism in class before. We may or may not have, but now you definitely have to discuss Orientalism in class. So Orientalism is a book that Said is, okay, Shubhash, you are Shubhash, but that day you were not Shubhash. You were someone else. What Edward Said was doing in his 1978 book Orientalism was, he was looking at the discourses about the Orient. We know that the Orient stands for the East and the Occident stands for the West. Of course, there is no absolute division of what is the East or what is the West, because everywhere is relatively in the East from everywhere else. Similarly, everywhere else is relatively in the West from everywhere else. But when we say that Eastern countries or Western countries or Eastern characteristics or Western metaphysics, we have a specific East and a specific West in mind. That specific East is usually places like Japan and India, China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, etc. The West would be the West, what we understand as the Western Hemisphere. So that would be England, France, Germany, the United States of America, etc. But if we again think about the West, we will unfortunately find ourselves finding Australia and New Zealand, which fall to our east part of that list. Right now, why is this the case? What is the thing about East and West that is important, for which Edward Said had to write a very, very important book, and then people, and that went on to influence the way political thought and post-colonialism has been shaped, especially in literary studies. What Said is doing is he is giving us a bunch of examples of colonial discourses, because he's talking about how Orientalism becomes possible. At Said's time, there was still very, very remotely existing a class of school of thought which was called the Oriental thought. And so, if you go to England and you want to study in England, actually you could do a master's in gender studies in SOAS. SOAS is a school of Oriental and African studies, right? When we think of people like William Jones or that other man whose name I don't remember. Oh, Max Muller, of course. Who are they? They were called the Orientalists, right? So if these people are what is Orientalist about them? They were reading texts. They were talking about things which were considered to be Oriental, which belong to the uh, Eastern Hemisphere broadly. But they also were talking about certain attitudes, certain ways of being, certain mindsets, certain forms of government, certain cultural traits. And in the process of doing so, they were essentializing them, right? So this is what Said is saying. Said is saying that in the practice of Orientalism, in the discourses of Orientalism, Western knowledge formations have always considered the East, the Orient, to be A, inferior, B, to be uncivilized, C, to be effeminate or feminine, D, to therefore be in need of civilizing, to be spiritual, to be mystical, to be dirty, basically everything that the West is not. So what the Occident does is it creates the Orient in as its other, in order to both define the Orient but also to understand itself as in opposition to the Orient. As a result of that, he also talks about widespread essentialization of diverse. Nobarun's audio has not connected. Somebody has to message him and tell him. Uh, so what we also see is this widespread and diverse geographical area which is brought into under the umbrella of some kind of homogenization. What kind of homogenization? So he gives us specific examples. The French had colonies in the east, and the British had colonies in India. But if we compare what is being written about 19th century Egypt and 19th century India, they are largely similar. The British are describing the Indians as indolent, as false god worshippers. The French are describing the Africans as indolent and worshippers of false gods, right? So what this then is, so what he shows us then, two things. One, he talks about the opposition of the Orient with the Occident, and the creation of the Orient as something which is opposite to the Occident as a function of power. So it's not something that happens automatically, it is something that is discursively created, and it is possible. Why is it that the Indians and the Egyptians are not, or the Afghans, not defining the English, but the English or the French are defining the Indians and the Afghans? And he says that it is a function of power. It is because these countries established colonies, because they held power over these other countries, other regions, they could seek to, and they ended succeeding in defining these people, the Orient. And the second is, of course, what we just mentioned, essentialization, and we mentioned it because of real me, which is probably Subhash, is what I think he's saying. A comment that the thing that the Western world has already thought is that the eastern part of the world is illogical, and it is very much evident here. Yes, agreed, absolutely. In the novel, we have, although the narrator does not say so, from the description of Reverend Brown and the deputy commissioner, we see how they consider the Igbo people to be inferior, to be illogical, to have no sense of peace, to have no sense of civilization. But what is interesting about the novel is that the narrator does not do that. The narrator is letting you form your own opinion, letting the reader form their own opinion about whether or not the Igbo people are an inferior race. And if one goes along the grain of the reading, one would not conclude that the Igbo are an inferior race. One would probably be more on the side of difference. So the colonial state had its own logic, but the Igbo culture also had their own logic, and one would stick to that. So this is something that we had not addressed in the previous class. The next Okay, next one was from Afridi. He also in the first class, he said that again, here comes the predictions of oracles like we see in Oedipus. Therefore, Oronoko, sorry, not Oronoko, Okonko kills the boy out of impulse. Uh, Two or three things I would mention here, which is more important than drawing a parallel between Oedipus and Okonko's fate, although Okonko is indeed a tragic figure like Oedipus. More than drawing a parallel between them, it probably is more useful to think about the role that the oracles play in the two contexts. We have discussed at length what role does the oracle play in Oedipus Rex, but here, remember, the oracles are not people who they do not know. Unlike in Oedipus Rex, the Igbo people, especially the villagers of Umuofia, do not have to take huge long treks and go somewhere which they do not know. The oracles are the people who, at other points of time, parts of their community. It is only in special circumstances and in special instances that certain people who they so far knew as their friends and brothers, etc., that they put on the ceremonial mask or they come out of the ceremonial hut and they become the oracle, right? So that's one. And the other very important thing that we must mention and remember is that the oracle is not something that is dissociated from this culture. The oracle and the people who and the remembrance of the ancestors is something that goes very strongly within the grain of this culture. So people don't live simply as themselves, as the living. People live hand in hand and in close proximity with their ancestors. And when old people die, the old people are that much closer to the ancestors. So remember, one of the things that Okonko is most afraid of is when he dies, because his son Noe is now a Christian, there will be nobody to give food to his ancestral spirit. And that will merit a break from the way they have lived so far. So it's not some random fear, but something that is part of their everyday life. Having said that, it's possible to think of another connection and another parallel with everybody's name is another parallel with Oedipus. Oedipus heard the prophecy that he will murder his father and marry his mother. Nobody made him murder this man he meets at the crossroads. You could argue that for Okonko, there was the diktat that Ikemefuna will have to be sacrificed to appease to both pay the price of what has been done to their village by murdering somebody's wife, but also to assuage the spirits who are looking for a sacrifice. Nobody said that Okonko will have to participate in that sacrifice. And we see that his friends actively discourage him from participating in that, especially because he has brought this boy up as his own son. Till here, I think we can draw a parallel. But can we still draw a parallel beyond that? Oedipus had murdered that man at the crossroads because he did not know better. Okonko definitely knew better. Okonko was also trying to prove his masculinity and his bravery in front of people who already knew him to be masculine and brave and strong and warrior like and whatnot. So he did not have to do that. So he does not, if there is a, I think this is where the parallel ends. Okonko does not murder from a mere impulse, neither did Oedipus, I think. But Okonko murders having known very well that he should not be doing so. Still, he goes ahead because he wants to prove that he is the most fierce warrior there is. which is against the way the Igbo culture's certain kinds of pacifism that the Igbo culture has been shown as practicing in the novel. Okay, the third question that we did not address was la, la, okay, two things that very interesting things, and Srija has been talking about these in both the classes. Unfortunately, she comes in so late into the class that we don't end up addressing them. So the first one that Srija had said was Okonko's father's failure in his practical life functions as id in Okonko, which tries to come out to demolish his past and recreate a renewed present. That's one. And the second, the comment from the second class is that, according to Freud, the rejection of one's father preceded the sexual impulses for one's mother. Is this apt in the context of Things Fall Apart? The author also fails to grant Okonko's mother a name. So while I agree with the first comment, we don't merely have to be Freudian in it, but we definitely see we could be Freudian in it, because the id is associated with certain kinds of indolence, certain kinds of let's say if strictly the id is also associated with appetite for violence and for sexuality and for food. Probably that is something that we don't see in Okonko's father, but we do see a certain kind of indolence, something that is considered undesirable in society. So for Okonko to be the perfect person in this society, to be the most revered and esteemed person in this society, he will have to reject his father. So yes, in that way, by rejecting his father, he is also rejecting the softer, the more cherishing and nourishing sides of his personality. There is another external manifestation of the same. This manifestation comes in with his son Noe. Noe is also more cherishing and more nourishing than Okonko is, which he hates. So finds in Noe those things that he hated in his father, and those things that he has suppressed in his character, things that he is forever hiding from or forever fighting away. So yes, I agree that his father does uh, function as something in opposition to which he is developing his own character. But whether or not we can actually call it the id, given that the id is also psychoanalytically associated with certain things, I am not so certain. Second comment about why is Okonko's mother not named? This I think I referred to in the previous class. It might be because it is also uh, it is also possible that in the previous that given that the culture was so extraordinarily masculine, and given that women were hardly ever in any position of power, we only have three women who are named, right? The middle wife, Ezinma, and the this person, and Chielo, the priestess. That's it. So that could be a reason. But also that Okonko does reject his father's side of his mother's side of the family. He finds them to be too effeminate. So his rejection of his mother is probably evident in the narrative by not giving a great space to women. But it could also be the fact that the society is such that there isn't a great space for women. Yeah. Okay. The other one excellent example, which I felt, and one really fantastic way in which women's position and women's marginality in that society is brought out, is when this woman who was who was repeatedly giving birth to the twins, and the twins were being abandoned in the evil forest, when she embraces Christianity. Because throughout the narrative, we know what is done to twins. We know what is done to children who are Ogbanjes, whose mothers repeatedly give birth to dead children, because it is the same evil child, same evil spirit, who is repeatedly coming back to taunt and haunt the parents. But we forget, and the novel does not really dwell upon the actual physical act of giving birth, the physical act of holding a child in one's belly for a number of months, and also the kind of bond that a person who is giving birth to these twins is expected to have, right? So if that is the case, then by this woman's rejection of the religion that has made her abandon her children repeatedly, by embracing Christianity, this I think is something exceptionally powerful. And this is something that is done so subtly that we usually do not comment on it. But if we do comment on it, it only further strengthens our appreciation of Achibe as a novelist and appreciation of the narrator as somebody who is not taking sides, who is showing us the Igbo society that is absolutely absent from English language fiction of the period, because it is largely written by the colonizers. It is absent from ethnographic narratives. It is absent from historical narratives. It is absent from official documentation. So, the kind of discourse that Edward Said analyzes in Orientalism, which helps us understand what Orientalism is, that kind of discourse will not have any space for the narrative that Chinua Achebe writes. And he does the same, right? So we have a question from Lucy here. We'll keep it here for the time being. Is there another that I have missed? Just give me a second. Okay, we'll take two together. One was a comment from Romit in the previous class and what Lucy has said in this class. Romit's comment was the fact that the author is omniscient and detached allows him to portray the otherization without bias. This was Romit's comment. And Lucy's comment today is, in Chinua Achebe's point of view, can we say that he wants to show us the good side of missionaries to educate the Igbo people through Okonko's son, Noe. Okay, uh, we'll take the second comment first. Yes, it's never, when we look at the way missionaries have evolved in the course of the novel, there are three missionaries that Okonko and the village of Umuofia encounters. One is this man called Kikaga, Kigita, Kigata, something like that, whose name I do not remember, who was not considered a threat at all. Number two was Mr. Smith, who was willing to listen to the people of the Igbo land, and he was willing to incorporate certain aspects of their rituals and certain aspects of their belief in order to make his religion more acceptable to others, to the people he's preaching to. And the third is Reverend Brown, who does not have anything. Nobody has anything good to say about him, and that results in the church being burned down, and finally all the ignominy that is heaped upon the Igbo people. So yes, Achebe is never saying that there isn't anything good about the missionaries. Already, the fact that the missionaries have accepted the outcasts into their fold is something that is positive. There is no way in which you can go against that. And that the Igbo people are being educated. And you know, somebody like Noe would be somebody like Achebe himself. Achebe's father was the only person in his family who goes to a missionary school, who has this English education, and he also becomes a priest. But no one else in the entire Achebe clan was a Christian. So Chinua Achebe is growing up as somebody who both goes to the European school, reads the Bible, reads Shakespeare on one day, and the next day goes to the traditional storytelling circle and sits there and listens to the stories that are being told by the elders. So this is the kind of appreciation, but also the kind of connection, the divided self of the author himself, that probably we have only a bit of an anticipation towards this divided self of the author through the figure of Noe. Okay, we will stop with discussing whatever we had discussed earlier. We'll stop it here and we'll proceed with today's lecture. In today's lecture, we will continue to talk a bit about the representation of culture. So I just said that Achebe considered himself to be a divided person. somebody who was brought up in both languages, who was educated in both systems of education, and who was also in who's also writing in something which is the language of the colonizer, writing in the format of something which is an alien form to his storytelling, his culture storytelling ability, but writing about something which is extremely close to him. Again, when we see that it is say that it is extremely close to him, remember he's writing about things which happened 100 years before he comes. He is writing things fall apart. The African continent has been besieged by the Europeans since the 16th century. 16th century, because we remember the slave trade, but also remember that the cross Atlantic slave trade was carried out largely with Western Africa, West Africa coast. The Europeans did not usually venture further inland, especially not in order to capture slaves, because the trade that they were doing was with other princes or tribal leaders of the West African coast, which in various parlance is also called the Gold Coast and the Coromantine Coast. So, but once the slave trade is abolished, and we remember, if you remember anything of your, oh, were we supposed to read Mansfield Park? Maybe not. No, someone else was supposed to read it with you. Anyway, if we had read Mansfield Park together, this would be drilled in your head that the Gold Coast, the slave trade is abolished by 1816, and there's an act of parliament, and there's a lot of abolitionist debates that are going on. So then, in order to generate a profit, the Europeans can no longer trade in people. What do they have to do now? They now have to trade in objects. So they have timber, they have ivory, and they have palm oil. Palm oil is considered to be a very good lubricant for the machines for the factories that are coming up due to the industrial revolution. So Africa then becomes this one place which has to be, everybody's clamoring for Africa. All the European nations want to go there, all the European nations want to establish their colonies there. And in 1885 we have a division of Africa, uh, in which different colonial countries are given a parcel of Africa for their work. Of course, people don't actually agree with it, but that's how, that is the sort of violence that has happened to the African continent. Chinua Achebe is writing almost 100 years after the Nigerian people encounter the white colonizers, the missionaries, the businessmen, the merchants, and their military power. So it's not simply about representing a culture, but to also represent a culture which is now no longer there. So this is also a reclamation of the voices that had once upon a time been the dominant voices in that region, but voices that have so far been hidden from new forms of literature. So, and so when he shows us this African culture, remember he shows us a specific kind of culture. He's not showing us the imperial tradition in African culture. There were kings, there were places where there were a lot of kings, but he shows the Igbo as isolated from other people and also democratic. Although there is a hierarchy, this hierarchy is more on the basis of who achieves what and less on the basis of who is whose son, etc. The British bring their hierarchical system of government to the Igbo people. And in failing to find the king among the Igbo people, they think that the Igbo people do not have a system of government at all, which is not true, as is evident to us uh, in the text. There is a system of a fairly complex system of government by the elders, by the spirits, by the oracle, by rituals, by practices, by observances, etc. And so for every act of violence, for every indiscretion, there is also something that will balance it out. Uh, The Igbo have a democratic system where the clan decides what should be done. A man is judged on his own merit, not on the basis of others or their fathers. Uh, then also, the observance of a person's religion is not something that is governed by a priest. It is governed by its the one's religious observance is a matter between oneself and the god. It is only when one has a problem that the Igbo then go to a priest or to a spirit or to the oracle or whatever. So others are allowed to worship different gods. However, the British do not agree. The British want everyone to worship the same god. The British claim that they object to the Igbo gods because the Igbo gods promotes war. But in the novel, we see that the group of people who have been unilaterally violent and so violent that they have burned down an entire village are the British. The Igbo don't do that. On the other hand, the Igbos do not fight unless the gods have ordained them to fight. So even in the end, when Okonko thinks that the Igbos should capture all the messengers and go into a war, they do not do that. Now there is these colonial expectations. So we have only about 6-7 minutes. So write your questions if you want them to be addressed now. There's a colonial expectation that these African states were in constant warfare, but if they were so because they needed to accumulate fertile land. Moving to distant land was necessary for this purpose. Now Okonko's father Unoka did not do this. As a result, Okonko looked down upon his father. He himself would go and clear new land, and therefore he becomes wealthy. Both like Mr. Smith tries to show how both Christianity and Igbo religion have the same or one supreme god. In the Igbo religion, it is Chukwu. The Igbo system of justice is overseen by these ancestral spirit, the masked ancestral spirits, which are played by titled villagers. But you have to be able to distinguish between people who are playing the spirits and people who become the spirits at that moment of wearing the mask. So they try to settle disputes instead of blaming one man or the other. But so this is a more egalitarian system. With the British, you have a more hierarchical system. And the British do not understand that when a man wears the mask, they become the embodiment of the spirit. So by unmasking the man, they are actually not harming the man, they are murdering the spirit. These Igbo also try to rule through a combination of male and female principles. The earth goddess is a counterbalance to male strength. Therefore, for certain months in the year, certain cycles in the year, you are not allowed to do certain things. Some men are derided as women, like Okonko's mother's clan is derided as womanly, but at other time, others are praised because of their ability to get along with women. The tribesmen, am I repeatedly saying that this is a democratic system, that the tribesmen are expected to periodically distribute their excess wealth? We also have an exploration of the beauty of Igbo art. They shave their head in beautiful patterns, decorate the walls, there's music, there's dancing, there's proverbs. So you don't actually say that I want to marry. You say you begin by a proverb and the other person says another proverb, you say a third proverb. And the better decorated your speech is, the more revered a person you can be. The Igbo did not need the Europeans to carry them into modernity. They had their own system of government, their own system of religion, and it is also evident that change was possible from within Igbo culture. They discarded old customs when they had become irrelevant, such as the punishment for breaking the week of peace observances, because people were not breaking the week of peace observances. But they also have a more Old Testament-like attitude towards justice, like an eye for an eye. So why an eye for an eye? The man who lost a wife, the village of Mobino gives a wife as well as a young man for the young woman who had been killed in Mobino, right? So that young man is Ikemefuna and the wife. So now in our colonial system of justice, we will probably not consider this to be justice. So because of a death, you kill somebody, because somebody's lost a wife, you get another wife. What is important about this is that this makes Achibi's representational art faithful, because he is not hiding the more problematic or the more or less so-called quote unquote civilized practices. He is presenting to you what it was like, and he's letting you make up your mind whether you like it, whether you would rather choose the colonial culture over it, or what happens at the moment of this clash between one that is of a force of colonialism and the other that is a fairly more democratic but according to the colonizers primitive Igbo society. He highlights the problems and the faults, and it is those internal problems and the faults that allow colonialism to become stronger than it would have probably been at other parts. But colonialism also was inevitable because here the white supremacy, the white rule is backed by military power. Those who were trading with the British, they become wealthy. So supporting the British is in their favor, and the British are treacherous. So all of these things together, the might of the military, the treachery of the British, and the economic power which helped the British control a large part of the African population anyway, that results in the success of colonialism alongside the internal strifes and the disputes of what the Igbo society was going through. We will end here. We have 3 minutes. Shumon says, from the British perspective, is unmasking of the spirit one kind of civilizing the primitive society? Yes, because the British don't wear masks. They wouldn't even be able to understand why the hell are these people wearing masks. So, take off their mask. Let's see what is behind. But the fact of wearing the mask is the fact of investing embodied authority on this person. This the British do not understand. Romesh is saying, hence things fall apart is another proof that the colonized are often capable of self-government, though pre-established traditions and customs, even in a democratic way. The burden of the colonizers is just a facade. Agreed completely. There is no way to dispute that. Nanda had said earlier that Okonkwo, being the protagonist of the novel, negotiates the Igbo culture by beating his wives and killing the boy of Mubane, killing Ikemefuna. Yes, but he did not have to do that. That is the internal tension. So the kind of world that Okonkwo wanted to inhabit, that world was fast coming to an end. Maybe even in Igbo culture, there was a time when you could indiscriminately murder people, when you could indiscriminately beat your wife. But in 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, that is not the world that we encounter. Even for that Igbo world, Okonkwo is a misfit because he wants to govern through and prevail upon people through violence, not through negotiation. So his negotiation is a failed negotiation, which is why at the end of the novel, he can neither identify with the colonizers nor can he identify with the people which he considers his own. All right, so we shall stop here. I think this must have been the fastest I have ever spoken in my life. So please join the Google Classroom. I am going to set up tasks. Please attend to them. Please listen to them. Please write, comment, blah, blah. Yeah, yes, Romit, agreed. Okonkwo was already an anachronism. So with this alienation of colonialism, he is doubly an anachronism. But which is not to say that other people, if they were not like Okonkwo, they wouldn't have suffered. They would have suffered. Through Okonkwo, we see the failure of both the systems. But for others, the imposition of colonialism was something violent, was something that could not in any way be justified. Okay, and for those of you who do not know the meaning of anachronism, it is like something that belongs to a different time. So it's like writing with a fountain pen now is an anachronism, but will I give up my fountain pen for that? No, I will not. So that is how things are. We shall end here, and I think we have a class tomorrow. I shall send you the link.
Ma'am, I had a question.
You're too late, Shuman. Please write it in the Google Classroom. All right.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. The question I had yesterday, can I ask now?
Yeah, Romit was talking about anachronism. Can we assess anachronisms in a particular piece of art or literature uh, through new historicist or historicist perspectives?
I don't know why you are saying that. Say more.
মানে অ্যানাক্রনিজম যদি থাকে একটা ক্যারেক্টার, সে ফর জিমিকে বলা হচ্ছিল যে হি ইজ বর্ন আউট অফ হিজ টাইম সো দ্যাট হি ইজ আ রেবল। তো ওই যে অ্যানাক্রনিজম যে ব্যাপারটা আছে ওটা কি মানে হিস্টোরিক্যাল বা হিস্টোরিসিস্ট পার্সপেক্টিভ থেকে দেখা যেতে পারে? কারণ হিস্টোরিক্যাল পার্সপেক্টিভ থেকে তো অন্য পিস অফ আর্ট ওই টাইম লাইনের দিয়ে সেটাকে আমরা জাজ করার চেষ্টা করছি, তাহলে কি সেইভাবে কি আমরা অ্যানাক্রনিজমটাকে জাজ করতে পারবো কোনোভাবে?
আচ্ছা, প্রথমত historicist perspective বলে I don't know whether there is any body of criticism. There is new historicism. New historicism is not merely about setting something up in its specific context. তবে আমার যতদূর ধারণা জিমি পোর্টারের ক্ষেত্রে এবং ওকনকোর ক্ষেত্রে অ্যানাক্রনিজম তাদেরকে বলা হচ্ছে কারণ তারা ওই টেক্সটের ভেতরে যে সোশ্যাল কালচারাল পলিটিক্যাল মিলিউটা তৈরি হয়েছে সেই মিলিউয়ের ক্ষেত্রে বেমানান। বোঝা গেল? অতএব জিমি ইজ আস্কিং ফর a cause basically. জিমিকে কি বলা হয়? রেবেল উইদাউট আ কজ বলা হচ্ছে তো। সো হি ইজ, and one of the biggest things that bothers him is that there is no cause left anymore. Now, of course, that is a lie, right? Of course, there are many causes, but he thinks there should be a great cause which has been denied him, and therefore he is incapable of being the living up to his fullest potential, which is why he's being called an anachronism in that play. Similarly, for Okonko, there is Okonko believes, and we are also slightly led to believe that there is a pure world of masculine valor and bravery which the Igbo people used to inhabit. That world of Igbo valor is now no longer there, and therefore the way Okonko wants to live cannot be sustained any longer. Hence, he is an anachronism. He is somebody who does not fit his time. Now, in both cases, this description of Jimmy Potter as well as this description of Okonko are correct. But at the same time, they're also not entirely correct, because both in fact, Jimmy Potter are Okonkor dissimilarity থেকে similarity বেশি, কারণ they are also extremely aggressive masculine characters who are unwilling to look at the way the world is right now. অতএব ওকনকো যে শুধুমাত্র কলোনিয়ালিজম আসার ফলে অ্যানাক্রোনিস্টিক হয়ে যাচ্ছে তা কিন্তু নয়। Okonko was already anachronistic given the way the Igbo culture was. Now, we don't know whether in some mythical past the Igbo people were exactly like Okonko is. They probably never were. But right now, whatever Okonko is a misfit for both his specific context and the context of colonialism, which is why he's being called an anachronistic character. Okay, so 23 of the students have joined. Before we go into things fall apart today, I want to talk a bit about what we have to do for your term paper. You know that you have a mandatory term paper that you have to look at. So we'll begin with that. We'll speak about it for about 10 minutes or maybe less than that, and then we'll go to things fall apart. Things fall apart আমাদের আর ভয়ানক কিছু করার নেই। এই আজকের লেকচার এবং যদি আমরা উইকেন্ডে একটা লেকচার পাই, মনে করো যদি শনিবার দিন তোমরা একটা লেকচার অ্যাটেন্ড করতে পারো, we should be sorted. Then I'll give you certain readings and I'll assign people to do those readings, and though they should ideally read those things and write up summaries and share it with everybody. So that is what it is. So first we have to talk about the term paper. Now you know that you have a term paper and an annotated bibliography as one of the mandatory courses, right? Second, the term paper will be supervised. So you will be given a supervisor. As of now, you have only 3 of us. So you will get one of the 3 of us. But before you even reach to the state of the supervisor, you will have to decide upon a topic, and for the annotated bibliography section, you will have to write reviews of 3 relevant articles and 1 relevant book. এবার এইটা বলতে আমি কি বোঝাচ্ছি এটা একটু পরিষ্কার করে জানানোর চেষ্টা করা যাক। I'm going to share my screen. Somebody should let me know whether they can see the screen. Okay. Can you see this? যেখানে আমাকে Zoom বলছে যে Zoom 5.0 is here.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, very good. Now, so what am I, let's say, মনে করো I am a student who is going to do her term paper this semester. I'm giving you 2 examples of topics. One, let's say I want to work on migration and health, which is what is incidentally what I'm working on right now. So how am I going to find 3 relevant articles which we will review? Again, remember, when you are looking for articles to review for your annotated bibliography, you do not jump and go to academia.edu. First, you check the more reputed databases which have good journals. For example, we check JSTOR. You would say, ma'am, but we don't have access to JSTOR. প্রথম কথা হচ্ছে প্রথমে সার্চটা তো করবে, then if you do not have access to the article, you can send me the relevant information, I'll give it to you. So we go, let's say we go to JSTOR, we open a free account which you can open with your own email ID, and I search migration and health. There are, let's say, a whole bunch of, আমাকে বলছে যে এক থেকে I don't know 1,11,478টা result আছে. Fine. So I look at whatever the results are available for me, which ones I can read for free. So I go to this thing called Glossary Migration and Health. So it seems like it will give me a good overview of what is this migration and health thing all about. So we open this and we check this out. It tells us we can read this online. So we go and we try to read it online. ওই ভাই তখন থেকে তো বলে যাচ্ছি read online. Anyway, so if you can't download it, you do not download it. You just send it to me. I'll download it for you and send it. So you look at this article. You look at what is this glossary. So you find 3 articles which you think will be of relevance to whatever it is that you want to work on. So maybe we look at another article. We look at this one. Introduction to something called migration and health, and we can try to also read it online now, right? So when you read it, what do I mean when I say that you should write a review of this? What does it mean to write a review of this? First, you should have, so you are reading this article. Once you've read the article, second, let me see whether they actually let us access it online. So when you read the article, first you should be able to make a summary of the article. That is one. Second, you should be able to locate this article with your own concerns. So this is migration and health are interconnected in many surprising ways. The topic has insinuated itself into many important population and health issues, blah, 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 blah. So when you are summarizing, there are certain ways in which you summarize. You don't actually take everything that is there. You more or less get, and you remember this, you get rid of the examples largely. You concentrate more on the argument. You reduce the data to bare minimum. You also write it in your own words. So for an article which is 10 pages long, your summary should not be more than 2 pages long maximum. Even then, but that is not a review. A summary is not a review. In order for you to be able to do this review properly, you should also be able to say যে এটা কে লিখেছেন, এটা কোথায় পাবলিশড হয়েছে, কবে পাবলিশ হয়েছে, এটার স্টাইল কি রকম, এটা অ্যাক্সেসিবল কিনা, তোমার আর্গুমেন্টটা গুলোর সঙ্গে তুমি এগ্রি করছো কিনা, বা তোমার যদি কোনো ডিসএগ্রিমেন্ট থাকে তাহলে সেই ডিসএগ্রিমেন্টটা কি এবং কেন, কিংবা এই আর্গুমেন্ট ফলো করলে পরে তুমি নিজে যে বিষয়ে ইন্টারেস্টেড সে বিষয়ে তোমার তুমি কি জানতে পারবে। সো লেটস সে আই এম ইন্টারেস্টেড ইন novels which talk about migration and health. So I look at let's say a novel set in the 1660s called The Year of Wonder, and I try to understand why there's in the during the Black Death, why is it that people stopped moving out of this village. In order to understand that, so there is a stopping of migration. In order to understand that, I look at whatever I can find out from migration and health. এবার হতে পারে তিনটে যে আর্টিকেল তোমরা রিভিউ করছো সেই তিনটের মধ্যে প্রত্যেকটাই তোমার টপিকের সঙ্গে ডিরেক্টলি রিলেটেড নয়, হতেই পারে, but at least it should give you an understanding of the field on which you are trying to locate your work. Let's give you an example which is slightly more closer to what you do, which is from literature. So let's say we go to, instead of JSTOR, now we go to project news, right? We go to project news and we search project news for partition and women. This is what I got when I searched partition and women, right? So there's something called quarantine, women and the partition. Then there is something called gender, memory, trauma, women's novels on the partition of India. Tarpore, blah blah, unsettling partition, literature, gender, memory. Beyond partition, gender, violence and representation in post-colonial India. So let's look at this. Beyond partition, gender, violence and representation in post-colonial India. This is a book. So this might be something we want to look at. We will have to review a book as well. But for our purpose right now, this is not something we want. We want an article, so we look at something else. Okay. Unhomely nations, minorities and refugees of the subcontinental partition. So we go there. This is by somebody called Jisha Menon. So, and we cannot access this for free, right? So then what do? You take this DOI ID, copy link address. You choose that you will pirate it. So you go to scihub.se or one of the Sci-Hub sites. Yeah, you go to scihub.se, you enter the DOI, you click on open, you give all your love and affection to this brilliant woman who has done this for you, and you wait for your article to load. Once your article has loaded, you see that it is a 26 pages long article, and you do the same. You read the article, you review, you write a summary of the article, you write about the important arguments that are there, you write about your agreement or disagreement, or whatever connections you can draw with other things that you have read. Maybe you've read a partition novel and that has something to say, that has something which is directly relevant in the context of your reading of this. So this is what you have to do. This is our task for the টার্ম পেপার। তাহলে টার্ম পেপারে আমাদের কি করতে হচ্ছে? টার্ম পেপারে আমাদের তিনটে জিনিস করতে হচ্ছে। এক, আমাদের একটা টার্ম পেপার লিখতে হবে, কিন্তু সেই টার্ম পেপার লেখার আগে আমাদের একটা অ্যানোটেটেড বিবলিওগ্রাফি তৈরি করতে হবে। অ্যানোটেটেড বিবলিওগ্রাফিতে কি কি থাকবে? অ্যানোটেটেড বিবলিওগ্রাফিতে থাকবে আমাদের 3খানা আর্টিকেল এবং একটা বই। So, but before we can decide upon what articles and which books, we have to decide on my topic, right? What is our topic? So this is your task. Let's try and have a class on Saturday. By then you should have decided on a topic. Again, remember, deciding on a topic does not mean deciding on an argument. You could, for example, choose to research on the representation of women in Things Fall Apart, right? So you are not beginning with the argument. You are beginning with the premise, representation of women in Things Fall Apart. So then you go to JSTOR and Project News and you do your searches. You find 3 articles which seem relevant in it. You get those 3 articles and you also look for a book which is relevant. So this book could be, let's say, about Things Fall Apart. It can't be Things Fall Apart itself. It could be about Things Fall Apart. It could also be a book about Chinua Achebe, whatever. You make this bibliography and you choose the area of your research and you send it to me. Once you've done that, then you can go ahead and do your review. But of course, I am not going to look at all of the reviews. You will be assigned a supervisor. You will have to submit 3 reviews to the supervisor, 3 article reviews, and a book review to the supervisor. After that, you will write an abstract for your term paper, and then you will go on to write the term paper. বোঝা গেছে? কারোর কি কোনো প্রশ্ন আছে? যদি প্রশ্ন থাকে এক্ষুনি করে ফেলো। হয় লিখে করে ফেলো, নইলে বলে করে ফেলো, বাট করে ফেলো।
ম্যাম আরেকবার একটু বলে দেন না।
সায়নী শুন, আরেকবার বলো।
ম্যাম আমি বলছিলাম যে আমাদের সিলেবাসে যেগুলো আছে তার বাইরে, মানে সেটার সাথে একদমই রিলেটেড না এরকম কিছু টপিক নেওয়া যেতে পারে তো?
একদমই নেওয়া যেতে পারে।
ওকে ম্যাম।
আর কেউ? আর কোনো প্রশ্ন?
হ্যালো ম্যাম।
হ্যাঁ বলে ফেলো আফ্রিদি।
ম্যাম প্রসিডিওরটা আরেকবার একটু বলেন না।
কি প্রসিডিওর?
ম্যাম যেগুলো বললেন একটু ফার্স্ট থেকে কি করব?
আমি এখন কেন বলবো? ইউ উইল গেট দ্য রেকর্ডিং, ইউ লিসেন টু দ্য রেকর্ডিং। মানে তুমি কি পুরোটা শুনতে পাওনি নাকি বুঝতে পারোনি কোন?
হ্যাঁ ম্যাম শুনতে পেয়েছি, শেষের দিকে পুরো মিউট হয়ে গেছে, মানে আওয়াজটা খুব কম আসছে, শুনতে পাচ্ছি না শেষে।
You can listen to it. When we upload the recording, you listen to it. But basically,
ম্যাম আওয়াজটা খুব কম আসছে।
ম্যাম আওয়াজটা কম আসছে, শুনতে পাচ্ছি না।
Okay. Is this better? Hello.
ইয়েস
হ্যাঁ ম্যাম
ম্যাম,
একটু ঠিক আছে এবার।
নাও ইটস অডিবল।
ওকে, তো 3টে স্টেপ। প্রথম, নিজের এরিয়া অফ রিসার্চ চুজ করতে হবে। এরিয়া অফ রিসার্চ একটা ব্রড এরিয়া হতে পারে, যেমন হতে পারে যে representation of Dalit caste atrocity in Burma's Karuku, or it could be caste atrocity in Indian fiction, whatever. So then once you have chosen your area, you search for 3 articles and 1 book on that area. You send me the bibliography. Bibliography MLA স্টাইলে তৈরি হবে, 3টে আর্টিকেল এবং একটা বইয়ের ইনফরমেশন এটা পাঠাবে, এবং এইটা শনিবারের মধ্যে করে ফেলতে হবে। It's mere searching. Once you have done that, then you go on to write reviews of them. You write reviews of 3 articles and write review of the book, and you send it to your supervisor. You still don't know who is your supervisor, but eventually, hopefully, we will find out. But you keep the reviews ready. ঠিক আছে? Once you have submitted them, then you write the abstract to your term paper, because you have already read 3 articles and a book. So you know a bit more than you did when you decided on your topic. With that new knowledge, you now write an abstract to your term paper, after which you proceed to write your term paper. That is the procedure. আর কেউ আর কিছু? ওকে
ম্যাম রিভিউটা সবকিছু মিলে একটা রিভিউ হবে তাই তো?
না, 3টে আর্টিকেলে 3টে রিভিউ, একটা বইয়ের আরেকটা রিভিউ, মোট 4টে রিভিউ হবে।
ও আচ্ছা ম্যাম, প্রত্যেকটা স্পেসিফিক আলাদা আলাদা হবে।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ।
ওকে ওকে ম্যাম, লাস্টে কি বললেন একটু? অ্যাবস্ট্রাক্টের পরে কি বললেন?
অ্যাবস্ট্রাক্টের পরে টার্ম পেপারটা লিখবে, মানে আলটিমেটলি তো টার্ম পেপার লিখবে নাকি সেটা লিখবে না, রিভিউ করে ছেড়ে দেবে।
থ্যাংক ইউ ম্যাম।
Aditi, MLA 8th edition, yes. Okay, if these questions are sorted, then so the task.
ম্যাম টার্ম পেপারটা কি করে লিখতে হবে?
যেমন করে টার্ম পেপার কি করে লিখতে হবে, মানে প্রথমে তুমি একটা প্রেমাইস চুজ করবে, সেইটা নিয়ে তুমি রিসার্চ করবে, সেটা নিয়ে ভাববে। তোমার যে whatever is your primary text, যদি তোমার একটা প্রাইমারি টেক্সট থাকে, মনে করো থিংস ফল অ্যাপার্ট যদি তোমার প্রাইমারি টেক্সট হয়, তাহলে থিংস ফল অ্যাপার্টে কেমন করে মেয়েদের রেপ্রেজেন্টেশন, অর whatever স্পিরিচুয়ালিটির রেপ্রেজেন্টেশন অর কলোনিয়ালিজমের রেপ্রেজেন্টেশন, সেইটা তুমি দেখাবে। এই সম্বন্ধে অন্যান্য মানুষরা কি লিখেছেন সেইগুলি তুমি কোট করবে, তাদের সঙ্গে তুমি এগ্রি করছো না ডিসএগ্রি করছো না, টেক্সট তোমাকে অন্য কিছু জানাচ্ছে, সেইগুলো লিখবে। সো আ টার্ম পেপার ইজ লাইক আ long answer, about 3000 words long. Ideally, you should have an introduction, you should have a body, and you should have a conclusion. ওকে, আর কেউ? আচ্ছা,
ম্যাম বুক রিভিউ যেটা লেখা হবে ওটার সাইজ তো কম্পারেটিভলি অনেক বেশি হবে না আর্টিকেলস এর থেকে?
হ্যাঁ, কিন্তু তোমরা প্রথমে যদি বইটা খুঁজে বের করো, তারপর সেটা পড়ো, তারপরে রিভিউ লেখো, তাহলেই আমরা খুশি। Again,
Okay, ma'am.
there is no word limit of an article review. You can review, but you remember you have to summarize the article to write the review. So if you have a 10-page long article, your review should be, let's say, 3 pages maximum. Ideally, বইয়ের রিভিউ এখন মানুষেরা 1,500 শব্দ। Actually, let's keep it to that. Uniformly, article review দের লেংথ হচ্ছে 1,500 শব্দ, আর বুক রিভিউ এর লেংথ হচ্ছে আউটার লিমিট হচ্ছে 2,000 শব্দ। ওকে, আর টার্ম পেপারের লেংথ হচ্ছে 3,000 শব্দ। তো 1,500 আর্টিকেল রিভিউ, বুক রিভিউ 2,000, টার্ম পেপার 3,000। কিন্তু আর্টিকেল রিভিউ এবং বুক রিভিউ এর ক্ষেত্রে 1,500 ও 2,000 রেসপেক্টিভলি হচ্ছে আউটার লিমিট। আর কেউ আফ্রিদি কিছু বলবে?
No, ma'am, it's clear.
আচ্ছা, ওকে, all right. So then let's move on to things fall apart. Okay, somebody's there. Okay, or just says thank you. All right. Okay, there's 2 more. We are going to take 2 more classes, and then we'll be done with my teaching of things fall apart. We will be looking at things other people have said and read and written and uploaded, all that. So we'll take a cue from a question that Srija has been asking repeatedly about the situation of women in the novel. And so it's a very childish thing to say that the condition of women in the novel is represented in a manner that they are subservient to the men, etc. That is true, but there isn't a lot of critical acumen necessary to be able to say that. Instead, let's do something else. Let's look at one interesting and perhaps unusual character in the novel whose parallel we don't have otherwise, and that is Ezinma. Who is Ezinma? Ezinma is Okonko's daughter. She is his daughter by the second wife. Now, remember, we have talked about this twice before, that time in the novel is measured by generations, seasons, lunar cycles, planting, harvest festival, etc., even market days. We talked about this as messianic time that is cyclical in nature. Ezinma is as if the embodiment of this messianic time. Ezinma is introduced as the female principle in the novel that opposes and balances the masculinity of Okonko. And in fact, of all the children that Okonko has, given that Okonko is a virulently masculine and violent person, he talks most kindly to Ezinma, and he also gets along the best with Ezinma. Ezinma is an Ogbanje. What is an Ogbanje? The Ogbanje are called the living dead. They cycle back and forth between the world of the humans and the world of the spirits. What does that mean? So it's believed by the Igbo people that they can come back as a troublesome child who dies early. So a mother who repeatedly has infant children dying of her, it's said that the same child is coming back to her womb repeatedly, and she's doing so, or the child is doing so, in order to bother the mother. So what is the solution for this? And there is an elaborate ritual that is carried out by the priests when Ezinma falls ill. But other than that, there are certain prescriptions that are given to Ezinma's mother. So the mother must take a special care of the child to ensure that the child does not die. Now remember, in a country, in a situation where the infant mortality is very high, this seems like sound practical advice. But we don't know whether it is good to reduce things which are also considered to be of spiritual significance to mere scientism, which I'm not saying that there is anything against being scientific about it, especially in this day and age, one cannot say that, but there's no need to reduce other significations to that. Only the priests can decipher Ezinma's link with the spirit world, and All right. Okay. Isinma's linked with the spirit world, and so what they do is they try to seek and destroy her something called her Iua. What is her Iua? It's like this smooth white pebble that they find buried deep under the earth. When Isinma leads them to that place. Isinma has a very close relationship with Okonko, with her own mother and with Cielo. She is more forthright and inquisitive with her mother than any of the other children are with their mothers. In fact, her mother allows her to do more and to participate, to get more share of the family harvest than other mothers do. So she makes Ikwefi makes more allowances for her, allows her to eat eggs, and follows her when and Ikwefi is so taken by her responsibility towards Isinma that when Cielo takes Isinma on her back and carries her to the shrine for her to be cured, Ikwefi follows her, although she knows very well that it is prescribed that she should not follow the priestess. Isinma also has a very close relationship with this priestess, which is Cielo. Cielo leads a double existence. She is both a widowed mother of two children, and she is a priestess, and she understands, therefore, the mother's connection with the daughter and the daughter's connection with the mother, as well as the connection of the daughter with the spirit world more than any of the others do. Okonko admires Ezinwa's spirit. He is tender and loving towards her. He is not tender and loving towards anyone else, especially towards his son Noe. Although prohibited, he also follows Ezinwa and Chiole into the forest to the mouth of the oracle's cave. But in part 2 of the novel, Ezinma is rarely alluded to. So everything that we learn of her and of her exploits and of her being an Ogbanje happens in part 1 of the novel. So why is it that she okay, is there a problem with my voice still, or can you hear it now?
I can.
Okay.
And sometimes it's breaking.
Yeah, I think that's because my mic is slipping. Sorry. Hopefully the recording will be fine and you can listen to it later. But in part 2, Isinma is rarely alluded to. Why is that so? Why is Isinma rarely alluded to in part 2? Because the culture that validated her unique existence, a culture in which there is a very strong female principle, which is in contrast to the male principle, in which the husband can beat the wife, but the husband cannot beat the wife during certain weeks of the year, and the wife can seek redressal of her grievances, that culture is now no longer there. It is now undermined by an alien Christianity, which might claim to be more peaceful and more egalitarian, but is instead, unfortunately, more violent, and as it is also backed by military power. During his exile to Mubanta, Okonko views Izinma as his most prominent link with Umuofia. He even marries Izinma to somebody in Umuofia to ensure that his link with Umuofia is never broken. It remains intact. So it's possible for us to think of Izinma as a symbol of rebirth that the Umuofian culture might yet undergo. Whether this Umuofian culture will have a rebirth after Okonko's death, after the might of the military and missionary nation, colonial nation is removed, we don't know. But Ezinma's continuing prosperity in Umuofia ensures that the female principle continues to live in Umuofia. And through her, it is possible for us to hope for a rebirth or a regeneration. Another crucial thing that we should think about, and we've mentioned this twice or thrice already, is the link between the book that the deputy commissioner is writing and the book that Chinua Achebe himself is writing. You could argue that the commissioner is writing the book as a colonizer, as somebody who is in a position of power vis-a-vis the people about whom he is writing, as an outsider, as a non-native, as somebody who knows nothing whatsoever about this place, and one who believes he is civilizing and pacifying the primitive tribes of the lower Niger. In contrast to that, you could also argue that Chinua Achebe is an insider into this culture. He knows what he's talking about. But remember, we did say that he is writing about a culture which is 100 years before his time. He's writing as a person who is a byproduct of two distinct cultural currents of Western education of Christianity, as well as the rest of his family, which has neither embraced Christianity nor embraced Western education. Now, so the question then is, can the author be identified with the people that he seeks to represent? Is he instead a divided subject? Is his relationship with his novel an ambiguous relationship? For readers like us, the novelist is a teacher. Why is the novelist a teacher? Because the novelist is teaching us, readers like us, about certain cultural heritages, practices, beliefs, and positive sides of certain African cultures. But he's also writing in English for people who are like himself, for people who are also divided subjects, for people whose connection with their culture is tenuous at best, for people whose connection with their culture is mediated through the language of English. So for those people also, he becomes then a teacher. Now remember, the conversation that happens in almost throughout the novel, except for when he quotes from the book by the commissioner, that conversation is in Igbo. But we are not reading the novel in Igbo. We are reading the novel in English. So every time there is an act of translation involved in reporting Igbo experiences in English, every time there is an untranslated word, that implies that the whole word cannot be translated. So, Igi Uwa, he does not translate it. Ogbanje, he does not translate it. It is for us to understand what these words stand for in context, in the given context surrounding it. So that also shows how, although the author might try their level best to represent one culture to another, linguistically that is never complete. It is a process which is forever incomplete. That is the process of translation. In part 1 of the novel, the narrator's voice draws a rich picture of the Igbo heritage. But whose voice is this? The one who's telling us about the Igbo heritage? We've again talked about this earlier. Is it the voice of an Igbo insider? Is it the voice of a wise and sympathetic elder of the tribe? Or is it a recreation of the persona that is heard in fables and proverbs? There are a bunch of fables and proverbs that are told to us in the novel. Who is telling those proverbs and fables? Of course, some people are. So one finger that brings oil will make everyone else sticky. So the novelist is translating this proverb for us. But is the novelist telling us this proverb? But when we use proverbs, when we talk to each other in proverbs and in riddles and in fables, we are also drawing upon a shared heritage in which we know what each of these proverbs mean. So the novelist cannot be somebody who's outside of this shared heritage. The novelist is someone who is part of this culture of speaking in proverbs and in fables. So the novelist then seems to us that is trying to approximate that voice which speaks through and from proverbs, which gives you the cultural common sense of something without being judgmental about it. But so then you could say the novelist, the voice of the narrator, acts as the chorus of the novel, not as the hero of the novel, because the hero is someone who goes and does things. The chorus only interprets the action for the audience, and the chorus comments on the action for the audience. This narrative voice at times takes such a step. But the narrative voice also does not completely identify with the Igbo people that it represents, because the narrative voice also uses phrases as this: these people, the Igbo people, etc. So if I were talking about ourselves, I would not say these people or things like that, right? I would say us. So the narrative voice is also at the same time an insider, but an outsider, one who looks at what has happened talking to them in the third person, talking about them in the third person, but nevertheless a repository of all the knowledge that is necessary to be able to faithfully represent this. We'll stop here. Does anybody have a question? Yes, no question? Very good. What? এইটা কি বোঝা গেল about the proverb and fable and the voice of the proverb or fable? Let's think of about a proverb we know. যেমন আমরা বলি নাচতে না জানলে উঠোন বেঁকা. I don't have to explain to you what it means. All of you know what it means. Now, why do we know what it means? Because we have a shared cultural context. কিন্তু এই যে বলছে নাচ না জানলে উঠোন বেঁকা, সেটা তো আমি বলছি না, কেউ তো একটা বলছে, এমন একটা মানুষ, এমন একটা ভয়েস পার্সোনা সেই কথাটা বলছে, যেখানে যার কাছে এই এক্সিস্টিং ওয়ার্ল্ড অফ প্রভার্বস এন্ড ফেবলস ইজ সামথিং দ্যাট ক্যান ইজিলি বি ন্যাভিগেটেড. It is the common sense of a culture that is telling us this, and we all of us have access to the common sense of this culture that we understand this. সুমন, তুমি কি কোনো প্রশ্ন করছিলে?
হ্যাঁ, প্রভাবস আর ফেবলস এর ব্যাপারটাই জিজ্ঞেস করতে চাইছিলাম যে মানে এটা ব্যবহার কেন করা হচ্ছে, টু ক্রিয়েট আ সার্টেন ড্রামাটিক ইমপ্যাক্ট অর সামথিং এলস, ওই
No,
ব্যাপারটা?
no, no, no. Definitely not to create a dramatic impact, because this is also how those people speak. So remember, when these marriage negotiations happen, they are not going and saying যে আচ্ছা আমি এতখানি পাম অয়েল দেবো আর তুমি অতখানি পাম অয়েল দিও, তা কিন্তু বলছে না. They are talking in proverbs to show that they know the context, they know that they have to finally come down to haggling about what they need and what they should get, but at the same time they're also very, very culturally sensitive, and they are aware of the existing proverbs and fables are also about knowledge. So they are all knowledgeable people. ছোট ছোট বাচ্চারা গিয়ে কিন্তু এই ট্রানজাকশন গুলি করছে না, অত্যন্ত elder, the elders of the community are going and doing these transactions and having these conversations. So they are showing how they are all situated in this body of knowledge, and through that body of knowledge they will come to a solution which is amicable. And this is how this culture has been working. They listen to everybody, they have a market fair when they have to decide on something. They assemble upon the ground. So there technically anybody can speak if they want their voices to be heard. Ultimately you could argue that only certain people will end up speaking, that's true, but the possibility is there that everybody could speak. Also, talking in fables and proverbs is probably one of their narrative traditions which Achibe is trying to incorporate in this novel. So he's writing about Africa in a novel which is in English, but he has to try and make it as African as possible. And the way to go about it is to talk like that. Okay, our time is over. Nanda, I've got your question. I will keep it and I'll answer it in the Google Classroom. Oh, thank you. Proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten. Thank you so much. Goodbye. See you hopefully on Saturday.
থ্যাংক ইউ ম্যাম.